You're listening to a CNA podcast. Hello, it's Andrea Hing, and this is the Money Talks podcast, where we talk about all things money. Now, if you haven't already, please kindly follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music as well. That way, you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. Speaking of new drops, we are about to drop you some financial news. Junaini Johari, my producer, is with me now. Tell us what we have.
I'm sure you've heard by now that the US Congress has passed a bill on banning TikTok if it's not sold by its Chinese parent company ByteDance in 9 months.
Yep.
So TikTok creators in the US are extremely concerned because this ban will pretty much affect their livelihoods.
That's exactly what I had in mind when I first saw that headline. So how much impact has TikTok had on these businesses?
For small and mid-sized businesses, it's practically a lifeline.
Yeah.
Okay, according to an Oxford economic study backed by TikTok, the app fuels growth to more than 7 million businesses in the United States and supports more than 224,000 jobs. It also generated nearly $15 billion in revenue in 2023 for these businesses.
And that's just in the US. Can you imagine the rest of the world? Oh, this just goes to show how vulnerable small business owners are because, especially if they were to rely on just one platform, and in this case, they're in danger if that one platform is TikTok.
Exactly. And given that so many people, regardless whether you're in Singapore or in the US, rely on the internet for their side hustles, this just goes to show it's so important to diversify.
It's the number one lesson here on Money Talks. Okay, what's next?
Some good and not so good news on the stock market. Okay, so first, some good news.
Okay.
It's been a great first quarter for Great Eastern. They just posted a 26% year-on-year increase in profit to over 306 million Sing dollars.
Okay.
This is thanks to higher profits from its insurance business as well as its investment performance. The insurance arm of OCBC saw its profits go up by 4% this year, while profit from shareholders' fund rose 245%.
245%? Okay, so all of this, big numbers, sounds like a massive jump. What's the not so good news?
Singtel saw its shares dip by 3.3% after it warned shareholders that it expects a net loss in the second half of the year and lower net profit for the end of this financial year. So financial reports say they are expected to recognize a $3.1 billion non-cash impairment hit for the second half ending March 31st.
Okay, so basically, this means that there are parts of the company's assets that have reduced in value, and in this case, by as much as $3.1 billion?
Yes, in Sing.
Wow.
But the company has assured shareholders that dividend payments will not be affected.
Okay, that's good because a lot of us do have Singtel shares anyway.
Indeed.
Every now and again, we hear stories of people restricting access to a partner's finances, or a vulnerable elderly parent being forced to monetize their assets, only to have the benefits taken away by their adult children without their knowledge. These are just some examples of financial abuse. There are many more ways a person can end up being a victim of such abuse. In some cases, it's worse because they aren't even aware that they're being financially abused. So this episode of Money Talks hits different. We want to learn to identify the signs of financial abuse and be reassured that we can, in fact, seek help. And that help is going to come in the form of Chong Yue-En, advocate and solicitor and managing director of Bethel Chambers LLC. Among other fields, he specializes in mental capacity law, family law, and elder law. Yue-En, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you for having me here.
So, for a start, could you lay out for our listeners what exactly is financial abuse?
First of all, financial abuse is quite a wide and tricky topic. There is no fixed definition of financial abuse in Singapore as opposed to perhaps other forms of abuse like physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. However, I found some definitions that would be probably quite useful.
Okay.
And I sort of mashed them together. One of the definitions that I like is that it's an illegal or improper use or mismanagement of a vulnerable person's money, property, or resources without his or her knowledge or consent, and possibly under undue influence or undue pressure.
I'm personally struck by the word vulnerable because
Yes.
that's a gray area, right? How do you define vulnerable, right?
In one sense, we look at a set of law called the Mental Capacity Act. It presumes that everybody has mental capacity, which simply means the ability to make a decision.
Yes.
So because of that, an unwise decision or foolish decision doesn't mean you're vulnerable or that you are actually under any form of incapacity. But when
Yeah.
you talk about vulnerability, there is also another law that was enacted in 2018 called the Vulnerable Adults Act,
Okay.
which then brings in the concept of vulnerability, which
Right.
there is an assessment which talks about neglect, as well as other forms of abuses here. However, in all of these cases here, I think what would be useful is if we categorize it into two categories.
Okay.
First category means vulnerable, but you still have mental capacity, which means that if you were to think through the whole process of your decision to transfer that money to that lover you met online who you have never met before,
Oh dear.
and if you were isolated and forced to think through it, you might then come to a different conclusion because you have the ability to think about
Yeah.
it. So that makes you perhaps vulnerable to external pressures, probably undue influence
Yeah.
or pressure, but still there could be other effects as well, which I'll come to later, like
Sure.
economic pressure. Now, the other one is lack of mental capacity,
Yeah.
which means a few categories. First is because of a cognitive decline, very
Yeah.
often seen in Alzheimer's or dementia. So when that happens, because of diminishing mental capacity, you find harder to make decisions and to process information.
Right.
So in that case here, you become vulnerable because of an internal quality.
Got it.
The other thing is a stroke victim. Now, stroke victims, we all know they can recover. I've seen many of
Oh,
my
yes.
own relatives recovering from stroke.
Same here.
But
yeah.
it's the temporary period there where
Decisions
because
have to be
the decisions have to be made
Yeah.
and the family might be anxious and make it on the behalf of the person, and sometimes they may not be right decisions or good decisions at the
Yeah.
same time. The next category we really must emphasize on is special needs adults, those with lower capacity to begin with,
Yes.
congenital disability.
That's right.
Some of them may be working, they're high functioning, but because of their special needs, there is a certain vulnerability there.
Yes.
Now, the last issue I said is I really want to highlight this is because we have many foreign wives in Singapore. If you are a foreign wife and you are here in Singapore, you can't work because you're on LTVP.
That's right.
You're not on LTVP plus, which
Yeah.
allows you to work.
Correct.
And you're completely financially dependent on your husband. And he just does something like, please give me receipts for everything you buy.
Yeah.
Please don't spend money. Or the money that you have transferred from your overseas bank account, it all comes to me.
Yeah.
In cases like that, I'm afraid that it really does sound like financial abuse when this coercive control of everything that the wife, I mean, to be fair, there are also husbands these days in that position as well.
Absolutely.
Too.
I've heard stories plenty. Yeah.
But-
I think you brought up a very good term here, the word coercion.
Yes.
I think that is the common denominator in all of these examples that we've just cited. And that's what I wanted to get to as well. This coercion, I guess you could deem it as a form of domestic violence in a way, because often when we hear the word abuse in the domestic violence context, we would usually think of a physical element to it,
That's right.
Usually it's physical violence. How severe then is financial abuse in this context of domestic violence?
Well, let's just talk about financial abuse. Over the last 5 years, unfortunately, there have been 5 to 18 cases of financial abuse investigated.
Wow.
Unfortunately, think that this might just be the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, these are just the reported cases. Can you
Yes.
imagine how many more have gone unreported? So, in a marriage where one spouse commits financial abuse towards the other, you've noted foreign wives and as an example. What other kinds of scenarios might we encounter financial abuse in a marriage?
One of the spouses might find themselves in an economic vulnerable position, and that's because of the lack of knowledge of the expenses and the finances in the family. For example, the other spouse might be out there earning, making lots of money, doing lots of investments, but the spouse who is economic vulnerable has no knowledge.
Yeah.
And when that happens is when they unfortunately find their spouse divorcing them because they may have gone on to somebody else.
Yeah.
When they try to claim their share of the assets, they really just can't find anything.
Yeah.
I remember I have a very good friend, she's English, and she used to share with me how she and her husband did it because in their relationship, she was the one who gave up her career
Yeah.
in order to look after the family.
Right.
But what she and husband does every year is to lay out all the accounts of the family, all the expenses, all the properties, all the assets, and they will discuss. I think this is brilliant in building a strong relationship because
Absolutely.
the spouse who's economically vulnerable would feel less vulnerable in this case because
Yeah.
I trust you. You are
Yeah.
telling me, and every year I can see the difference based on what I can see and what I observe.
Yeah.
And that's something I really encourage all couples to
Yeah.
do, especially when one is dependent on the other. So let's say if you are the woman and you're an economically vulnerable woman,
Yep.
you're in a marriage and you need the funds for your children.
Yes.
There's something called maintenance.
Right.
Interim maintenance in the course of marriage where you can just apply for it and to get the funds. Of course, if you have to go to the extent of applying for a court order against your spouse, there probably are more issues, that's unfortunately.
Yeah.
But remember that is this recourse there to begin with because you shouldn't really need to find yourself out in the streets with your children, with no home, with no funds and everything else. And the whole maintenance system has been worked on by the family justice courts. And there's a lot more procedures to make it accessible and easy for the man in the street or the lady in the street to actually approach the court for help in order to get this maintenance that they need.
Yeah, so that access has been democratized for them. Now, in another scenario I have here, a parent-child relationship where the adult children abuse their access to their senior parents' monies. We do hear reports of such cases emerging in Singapore, and it's quite unfortunate. So an example I will throw to you here is, and I'm not to be granular, but in the event where out of 3 siblings,
Yes.
one is the primary caregiver
Yep.
of those elderly parents, and that sibling feels entitled to more of the funds compared to the other 2,
So
right?
because of that, they may feel that there may be expenses that they paid out of their own pockets.
Yeah.
They may have covered the hospitalization fees and everything else. I think the first thing, keep records. If you are that
Yes.
sibling, keep your receipts, keep your records. Because if
Yes.
you want to claim against mommy or daddy's estate eventually, you have to show your siblings. I mean, you can't fault them if you tell them that I paid $400,000 and they said, where's your evidence?
Yeah. So you mentioned this other group of vulnerable persons as well, those with cognitive, mental conditions,
Yes.
even those with special needs. And much like the other categories that we talked about, it usually does involve immediate family members or a caregiver with very close access to the victim's money. Might this be harder to detect given the fact that such victims don't always have the capacity, as you said, to handle finances, make those big decisions, be aware about what's actually happening when it comes to their estate and assets?
Yes, I think in this particular area, I will speak on 2 sides first. The first will be those who have not lost capacity yet and those who have lost capacity. One thing I want to start talking about is safeguards.
Yeah.
Now, we all have heard about lasting power attorney. Now, the lasting power attorney, there are 2 different forms.
Okay.
One is called Form 1
All
and
right.
one's called Form 2.
Okay.
From what I know, 99.9% of Singaporeans have done Form 1.
Yeah.
And the rest did Form 2.
Okay.
So what's the difference really? Now,
Yes.
Form 1, imagine this. I have a blank check.
Okay.
And I say, here's a blank check. You can do anything that you want for me on my behalf, make any decision. I absolutely trust you.
Right.
And on Form 1, it says that choose somebody that you trust.
Yes.
Because if you choose somebody who you trust but end up being someone who unfortunately financially abuse you, now that's the problem here. Because under the Dhoni regime,
Yeah.
there is no mandatory reporting to the Office of Public Guardian in
Right.
terms of the decisions made, whether on the finances or on the personal welfare, like accommodation.
Meaning to say that person, that appointed person, can do whatever you will.
Yeah,
whatever he or she
whatever
wills.
you will. So that's why you
Right.
really have to trust the person and know that this person knows you well. So the thing here about the LPA Form 1, that it is a great form.
Okay.
However, I think we all have to go in with our eyes wide open on what are the certain limitations
Yeah.
there. So the other thing is now the LPA Form 2. The LPA Form 2 is drafted by lawyers
Okay.
where you can put in restrictions and conditions.
Ah.
So for example, remember that both LPA forms are registered with the Office of Public Guardian.
That's right.
Which means at any point in time, any financial institution can call forfeit. Now imagine this. The LPA 2 says that I only need $100,000 for my living expenses in 1 year.
Okay.
And your donee goes to the bank and say, can I withdraw $200,000?
Right.
At that point in time, the condition in LPA2 will say so. We will alert the banker to say, the LPA2 says $100,000. So you see, much careful planning and more purposeful planning, as well the thought process that goes through, goes into Form 2, in the putting down of restriction and conditions, and that would probably help to safeguard the person who's safeguarding you. Now, another area is an area called trust. I want to highlight something called the Special Needs Trust Company. It is a company that is government sponsored, where you can keep your funds in for your beneficiaries who have special needs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you know what the best thing here is, because it is government initiated, the setup fee, 90% is actually subsidized by the government.
It's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer. And not just that, but they have also tied up with Great Eastern to have insurance policies that for what you pay out, Great Eastern pays out more upon you passing, so that your special need dependent would have this capital sum of cash. What Special Needs Trust does is it's not just a trustee company, they also have a social work element. So if you have a special need dependent in a nursing home, not only will they visit as trustees, but if the funds run down low, they will also help you apply for government grants. So Special Needs Trust is one of the options there that allows you to safeguard a portion of the monies. Of course, you can have other people in the family managing other inheritance, but this allows you to be there. The monies are invested by the public trustees.
So now I'm sure that sometimes people don't even know that they are being taken advantage of. I mean, we've all been there. It's not a particular group of people. These kinds of things are not discriminate. We've had bad relationships before. So you're just blind to critical thinking.
It's the emotion there.
Yes, it's in that moment. You're unable to see clearly what's really happening to you. So why is it so hard for someone to know they're being financially abused?
Well, first of all, unfortunately, I think that some of them actually do know they are being financially abused, but it's just difficult. Let's say that's your favorite son. Your favorite son, unfortunately, likes to drink a little bit too much. And he goes to your wallet and takes out $50 from it. That is financial abuse. But your son is also the one looking after you. You wish that he doesn't come back drunk so often. But apart from him, none of the other children have enough time to look after you. You are old, you're 80 years old, vulnerable, and you have to make all these difficult decisions. Like, am I being financially abused? I don't really like it. I wish you would stop. And there's this sense of helplessness there. It's a bit of learned helplessness. And I think that is one aspect of it when people do know. But on the other aspect is you may not actually know. Because you're like, hey, this is something that's natural. And then when you don't actually know, I turn out to be a bit slow to say whether it's financially abused. For example, if I decided to give my property to my oldest kid because I'm a traditional Chinese person who believes that the oldest should get the largest share of the inheritance. So is that financial abuse? The rest may allege so, but it may be from my own cultural background. So if you say you don't really know, I give a very good example. So there had been this case where you joint accounts. Now, joint accounts. So a parent put a joint account holder as the daughter. Now, they didn't really check the account. They depended on the daughter to actually withdraw money to take care of them. Then they got a notice from the bank, you have zero money left. $130,000 had disappeared.
Wow.
And when they went to check, they realized it was at the point in time when the daughter and the son-in-law business was doing badly and the money was being transferred to the company to pay for things. The daughter admitted, say she'll pay back, but that is not that you don't know you're being financially abused, but you may not actually see it happening.
You're
not
basically
aware.
left out in the cold. So those are certain scenarios where you can be unaware, or you are aware, you just feel like maybe there's nothing you can do about it, right? Now, if we suspect we are being financially abused, or more likely the case, we know someone who is being abused, we're observing someone we know being abused financially, what should we do from the outsiders looking in?
Well, there is a National Anti-Violence and Sexual Harassment Hotline. Now, this is the hotline that if you have a suspicion or you have a concern, you can actually call in to this hotline to express and let them know what's happening. Now, the other thing you could do apart from whistleblowing is evidence. Now, I think at the start of this podcast, I spoke about what evidence you will need. Things like bank statements. Now, bank statements, receipts. For example, if you feel that, okay, my money has disappeared, the first thing you do is go to a bank and apply for bank statements. Now, that's one thing, because bank statements are only until about 6 months or maybe a
Right,
year.
that's right.
Anything further, you actually pay for it.
Mhm.
I think more than 7 years, it may not be there.
Because you take for granted that it's going to stay there forever.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, so because of that, I would go and get the evidence as much as possible.
Right.
And after getting evidence, right, if I was financially abused, I would then go and seek legal advice to get to a lawyer who knows about financial abuse. Now,
Yeah.
earlier on, Andrea, maybe it's good to actually talk about it. Let's say if it's not a marriage, but it's a relationship.
Yes.
There's something called predatory relationships. I think there have been some recent cases in which that there were gifts given to certain partners
That's right.
and lovers in that sense, and they went to court in order to get it back.
Yeah.
A lot of this has to be done on what we call trust arguments, that the gift is actually held on trust by the other party. But
Right.
trust arguments are very complex, so you need to demonstrate the court and convince the court that there was a intention to create a trust arrangement, and in the holding of the monies itself.
Right.
That would take place in the high court. It takes quite a bit of evidence, and most of the time this happens either post the loss of mental capacity
Sure.
or post death, and it's a lot harder once the person who has been the victim is sort of gone. Yeah, to actually bring this case and recover.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky thing there. Now I'm sitting in with a lawyer. What should victim survivors ask their lawyers?
I think the first thing that you were to ask is, what can I do in order to recover the monies that are given away? And I think in cases like this, it is tricky, because if you have given the money away and you have made a foolish decision, the question is whether it can be recovered is much more challenging.
Of course.
Because in full capacity you gave it, and let's say it's all spent. Yeah, but I think what you ask is also your rights as well.
Yes.
Or basically, like, what rights do I have? So let's say, give an example. I am not so much a victim survivor, but I am the family member, and I know for sure that this other family member took the money and stole it. Now, under the law itself, under the Penal Code, Chapter 17, which is offences against properties, there are some very commonly known ones, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, like theft, extortion,
Yeah.
criminal misappropriation of property, fraud, cheating, or criminal breach of trust. So under each of these limbs, often you have to prove that the person had the intention and actually did it before there's penal sanctions against them.
Right.
But often it's harder when it's a family member.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think also malice is also hard to prove, right? Because it becomes an emotional, intangible aspect of the case.
Yes, and I think the thing here is that's why even more so, at the start we talked about having laws on financial abuse with criminal and penal sanctions. That's why even more so, because I know it's really difficult to investigate into why is it that this family member, and often it's a family issue,
Yeah.
but crime is not a family issue. Crime happens because it is a crime. And I think it would really benefit us to have this definition of financial abuse, that we've had criminal sanctions and penalties in order to better safeguard and protect. But at this point, I would also like to bring in the issue of mediation, because often right at the genesis of something happening, when there's a bit of unhappiness and before it proceeds any further, bring the whole family to the discussion table.
Yeah.
Get an elder mediator or someone who is good in mediation, someone who's willing to spend the time to play the peacemaker
Yeah.
before it gets any worse and that actual wrongful acts are committed.
Yeah. Okay, what if I can't afford a lawyer? What are my options then?
Good question. Now, if you can't afford a lawyer, let's say if you are the foreign spouse, there is something called Project Live by the Law Society.
Okay.
Why I say foreign spouse is because if you are Singaporean or permanent resident, you can apply for the Legal Aid Bureau.
Right.
So the LAB means testing would then give civil assistance,
That's
legal
right.
assistance.
And if I'm not mistaken, the government has announced enhancements to the LAB.
That's right. There has been enhancements to LAB that are coming up, different amendments in order to help more of the sandwich class.
Yes.
I mean, I speak as a legal assigned solicitor, which I'm a volunteer lawyer at LAB. They have been doing a lot over the years in
Right.
order to promote access to justice.
Yeah.
So that's why the Law Society actually is also coming in to cover the gap where LAB doesn't cover in terms of
Yes.
women.
Sure.
So if there's situations where mom or dad has a deputy or donee. Now, what is a deputy? A deputy is a person appointed by the court to have powers to manage your assets when you don't have mental capacity
Got it.
already and you didn't do an LPA.
Okay.
Now, I had a case where, well, the person who was appointed to manage the money seems to be not actually managing the money.
Right.
No, they were a very poor family and they needed the funds,
Yeah.
but it was just unknown why it wasn't being distributed. I had to bring the deputy to court to ask for an accounting.
Yes.
Thankfully, the money were all there.
Okay.
I mean, there was a bit disputes over how some of the money was used, but in the end, I managed to get the spouse of this person who has lost some capacity to become a co-deputy in this case
Right.
in order to safeguard his wife's assets. The other famous Donnie case is the Yang Ying case, China
Okay.
tour guide.
Mm-hmm.
So in case of Yang Ying's case, it was very clear there was financial abuse. So bring back the question here that how would you know? So Madam Chong, who was the victim in this case, had a niece who actually started realizing why are all her long-time employees, like her gardener, her driver, her helpers being dismissed.
Right.
So when you start seeing signs like this, things that very drastic changes,
Yeah.
that is one thing that alerts you that maybe financial abuse is happening. Yang Ying came and brought his family over to live in the house. He started selling off her art collection and he sent about $1 million, as far as I remember correctly, to his bank account overseas. So that is financial abuse happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think on that basis, the Mental Capacity Act thus says that if there is anyone who commits a crime, then they shouldn't be a donee or a deputy. You can ask for the revocation of their very powerful position.
Yeah.
Because a deputy and donee has powers to manage and you are vulnerable because you have no mental capacity.
That's right.
There's something called professional deputies and donees. Have you heard of it?
No.
Okay, so professional deputy and donees are a group of either doctors,
Okay.
nurses, accountants, lawyers, social workers,
Okay.
or allied health professionals who've been accredited with the Office of Public Guardian
Right.
in order that if you don't have a deputy and you have already lost capacity, the court can appoint a professional deputy to manage your assets for you.
Okay.
Or if you are doing an LPA and you say, look, I'm alone in Singapore, I don't have very close family members, I can appoint a professional donee. These are basically people who've been accredited
Right,
by
right.
the Office of Public Guardian.
And the
then
court will appoint
the
them.
court appoints a deputy,
Right.
but you appoint a professional donee.
Right.
You have the power to find someone who you're comfortable with, someone who understands you well, someone who's a professional, and who will be there to actually see you through your incapacity years as well. If you just unfortunately find you can't find a friend, a family, or neighbor
Yeah.
to do it for you. Or maybe you may not just want to trouble them.
Yeah, I find that reassuring. I find all of this reassuring that there is support, there are resources to help people who may be in the midst of being financially abused. And you can, as a third party, a friend or a colleague or a family member, a loved one, look out for the signs
Yeah.
and know where to turn to in order to, hopefully resolve and gain back not just the money, but years of happiness that may have been lost. Yue-En, you've been very helpful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk to us about this seemingly invisible issue. I mean, I'm sure our listeners will agree. One more thing though, before we let you go, we have a new feature on the Money Talks podcast. I promise it's quite fun. It's called Questions from a Hat. It's exactly what it is. So I'm going to have this hat here.
Okay?
This hat has 5 questions in it. All you need to do is pick one question. Okay, Yue-En, what financial advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
One financial advice I will give myself is really take the time to understand investments and monies. Invest early.
Yeah.
It's not so much of whether you make money, but it's more of the education than the knowledge.
Yeah.
That is something I would tell myself.
Thank you so much. And really, this is a pertinent issue. I hope it brings more people to see the light and be reassured that there are ways out of financial abuse. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
And to the listener, if you believe you or someone else is being financially abused, get help from a family service center, or you can call the National Anti-Violence and Sexual Harassment Helpline. 1-800-777-0000 is the number to call. Now, thank you for listening to this episode of the Money Talks podcast. If you have any questions or comments, feedback, feel free to drop them in the comments section. Money Talks is streaming on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as YouTube Music. Leave us a rating while you're there if you like what you hear. Big thanks to the Money Talks team as well. Crispina Robert, Junaini Johari, Tiffany Ang, Joanne Chan, and Chong Yue-En. I'm Andrea Heng. We'll catch you in the next episode.